What we're going to do in this session is we'll hear from some panelists who have just recently switched to these best practices within the last year or two, and they'll go over and share some of their experiences, share what that process looked like for them, share who they collaborated with on campus. So thank you very much for all those panelists that are here to join us today. Before we introduce our panelists, just to introduce ourselves. So I'm Jerry Miller. I'm sector lead for the education team at Esri, and I also teach at Johns Hopkins University. And I don't manage the ArcGIS Online organization there, but I see it on a day-to-day basis. And Peter, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Peter Knoop with the University of Michigan. I'm a research computing consultant in our College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, where I work with faculty interested in using GIS and cloud computing and extended reality in their teaching and research.
Wonderful, wonderful. So for this second session, again, the panelists that you see here, thanks to all of them for agreeing to join and share their experiences. So all of them, as I mentioned, have introduced or have adopted these best practices just very recently within a couple of years. And as you can see, I'll allow the panelists to introduce themselves, but as you see, there's just variety of positions within the institution. So with Carlos's case, system architect, research programming, Amy's in the library, so JS librarian, Corey's manager of instructional computing, Ryan is an associate teaching professor, and Dahlia, Alex, and Freddie from UC Riverside, they're actually part of an ITS team. So they're an IT team, so they'll share their unique perspective from an IT side of things. That is, they don't know GIS, they're not geospatial professionals, they're simply IT professionals, and we thought it would be wonderful to have that perspective as well, as some of you are thinking about these best practices and in terms of how to reach out to those IT professionals across your respective campuses. And Peter, over to you.
Okay. We're just going to start with a few quick introductory slides here to sort of pick up where we left off. And then most of the session we want to dedicate for you to hear from the panelists, and then some time for Q&A at the end. So we left off with this slide here sort of describing what we'd found from the various universities that have been doing this for a while, but sort of the three fundamental principles were here, the centrally funded education institute agreement. And in fact, I'm going to recharacterize this slide as how you navigate the change to a cloud GIS campus. So how do you build support from stakeholders to get that centrally funded education institution agreement? How do you implement single sign-on enterprise accounts, new member defaults to support the best practices and the automatic access and scalability? And then most importantly, perhaps, how do you build these collaborations or build bridges between GIS, IT, and administration to achieve these goals? And it's a shame we didn't have this slide in the last session, because it would have gone great with the one question we had. But one of the most common questions we get is, why become a cloud GIS or a geo-enabled campus or the geospatial cloud or WebGIS, whatever your favorite version of the term is? And often one of the root things you need to do is, how do you communicate the broad applicability of GIS to your campus stakeholders? And we're going to hear a number of success stories from today's panelists. There's also a few highlighted on the Esri higher education site for the University of California, San Diego, which Amy Work is going to speak to today, and ours at University of Michigan. And then also, there's a link on here that'll take you to our U of M ArcGIS usage dashboard. If you're not there yet and you want to show what one looks like, I think this almost makes a great little icon or infographic. We have a continually growing user base. That curve is getting steeper every year, so we're getting more and more users. And we already have 70% of our units and over 80% of our degree programs where people are using GIS. So you can see what it looks like on the other side with a geo-enabled campus. So I also wanted to set some context for what we asked the panelists to talk about today. We asked them, what was your critical to your success in adopting best practices for ArcGIS? How did you identify your organizational stakeholders to support this process? And what were their roles? Where did you find them on your campus? And what did it take to get buy-in from them? And how did you identify collaborators to assist with the technical implementations? Who were your technical partners? Where are they located on your campus? And what did it take to get buy-in from those partners to be part of your process? And then just a general question about tips for fostering a successful collaboration among all these different groups it takes to build your geo-enabled campus. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist, Carlos from the UC Davis.
All right, and it looks like Carlos hasn't quite joined us yet. He was having a bit of technical issues. So that said, Amy, would you like to go next? And we'll have Carlos backtrack when he
Sure.
joins.
Yeah, let me go ahead and share my screen here. So, share screen. Let's do this. And here we go. Okay, so I'm going to share some of the best practices that we've implemented here at UC San Diego. So my role is a GIS librarian, and I've been here for about 2 years, but this is really a part of a larger team effort that I've been working with. So my colleagues Miriam Sarkrish, who's a campus ITS information analyst, and Michael Stewart, who is our operations manager in our library ITS department. And so I'm able to speak, but it really was a team approach to be able to implement some of these practices at UC San Diego. And so we took our approach in implementing single sign-on. We just activated our single sign-on in September of 2019. So almost a year now with it activated. But the process it took to get there was about 6 months of several emails to our campus ITS department. And that came really from Michael and Miriam. So trying to figure out who do we need to contact to get that. So it was really this collaborative effort and sending emails, trying to figure out who can do this, who can activate it. So where I kept thinking it might be a more rapid process, it ended up taking 6 months. And we kept going back and forth between, do we want to use Shibboleth or our ADFS? And so after discussions and understanding that Shibboleth might not was on a moratorium for maybe 2 years and integrating any new options, we ended up choosing ADFS for 2 reasons. One, the timeliness, as well as the opportunity of groups that ADFS provided us to help us manage our users for what we thought we were going through. Because we knew when we started, and I'll speak to this on the next slide, that we really had 35,000 students on UC San Diego and about 65,000 with staff and others. And so how do we integrate this and make this smooth for everyone to go for? So we ended up integrating ADFS, but at the same time, prior to implementing single sign-on, we had a cost recovery model. And so Miriam and her department were overseeing this cost recovery model where all students had access to the software for free, but departments or others would have to pay for the licensing. And so Miriam was really able to work and sort of eliminate this cost recovery at the same time we were implementing single sign-on. So giving everyone access meant, well, if we're giving everyone access, we're also helping to eliminate that cost recovery. And so within that implementation, what really helped us move forward, and presentations in the earlier session alluded to this, is that we had a production site and a sandbox site. So really able to test out things in our sandbox, make sure that we weren't breaking anything before rolling that over into production. And that's really helped us to make sure that we're not interrupting users or faculty or staff during key components of their session. So that's something that I would say it was really instrumental for us, and so moving forward with that. So once we had single sign-on enabled, and after the 6 months wait, this was really, we knew that we needed to enable new member defaults. And so hearing from others, this was really an exploratory process for us. So before we had single sign-on, we were trying to mitigate and manage people through multiple roles. So we wanted to know who was faculty, who was staff, who were GIS power users, because we were manually adding them or batch adding them. But after single sign-on, we realized we only needed a single role, and that we could use our ADFS to help understand the dynamics of our campus. And so we eliminated the multiple roles into one. And we also did an assessment across campus. So what are people using in terms of licensing? Prior to this, and we're still a campus that's heavily using ArcMap, but in this past year, we've really seen a transition to ArcPro. But what we enabled were access to licensing across all software platforms. So we didn't really want to have any information with dealing with licensing. So how do we end up providing software access to people without being a gatekeeper? So we have licenses. We're enabling to provide access to the software without being a gatekeeper. And so we want to hear about issues, not gatekeeping, not access to licenses. And so Miriam and her department have been able to handle that. But the other thing we did is we've also been able to provide access to GIS software, both past versions as well as future releases that maybe aren't deployed across campus, into a single site. We're using Google Drive right now, but it's secured, and so everyone signs in. What we're dealing with now are people that are not UCSD or not signing in with their UCSD credentials and wanting access. The other thing we did with new member defaults was setting credits. And so in exploratory work beforehand, we started with 500 credits, and we said, because we had multiple roles, so we started with 500 and we said 2,500 for GIS power users, and then we'd roll in between. When we migrated to just the single role, we said flat across the board, 2,000 credits. If people need more, we'll allocate more, right? We're not hindering credits. It just enables a conversation, as others have said, to have with the patrons about, well, what are they doing? Are they doing geo-enrichment? Are they doing geocoding? So these new member defaults were really exploratory in the process to figure out what's happening. On our campus, we have a business school, Rady Business School, that's actually leveraging geo-enrichment. And then we have a data science user. So we have a higher number of classes and programs that are trying to do analytics that are leveraging more credits. And so that's why we ended up going with 2,000. We still don't have too many people processing those, but we have some. Oh, wrong direction. So what are we looking forward to through all of this? So while we were able to implement single sign-on through that team approach, it's now helping to sort of manage our ArcGIS Online organization. And so developing scripts to help allocate credits when a user falls below a certain threshold so that we're not managing that information afterwards. Also disabling users that are no longer active in our ADF system. And I think we're interested in this really to say, how many current users do we have? We're still interested in that full perspective, but disabling. So that's still something we're exploring. And then ultimately, we need to deactivate duplicate users from where we're adding individuals via single sign-on now, and previous where we had people added for different classes. They have multiple different accounts, so that might be a 5-year process. And thanks to others in the community, we've also created a dashboard of campus users to really understand what are the demographics across our campus. And so this is still a draft, but it's still helping us to better understand who on our campus are using the software, what are they using? And that will help me in the library and others to be able to offer workshops or be able to better target departments that are using this. So is the history department using this? Okay, what tools do they need? What resources and what support can they provide? And the other thing is really to have continued community discussions. And in that community is not only with our constituents on campus, our stakeholders, our faculty and staff, but also you all with learning from the success stories of others. And I think that's been extremely helpful in helping us move forward. And so, as I summarize, right, our approach to implementing single sign-on was really a team. And as I mentioned, Miriam was our campus ITS person. She's our Esri license manager on campus. So being able to connect with her, Michael to be able to help from the library with Miriam and being able to move things forward with how do we get single sign-on? Who do we need to contact? And so they were able to move that stuff forward. And then Miriam and I worked both in managing the single sort of the new member defaults in the org and making sure that people have access to what they need without having to say, hey, I need this new license. It's just automatically provisioned so we can hear more about the issues or the technical workflows that they're struggling with. And then the implementers across campus. So our library ITS is developing and working with ArcGIS Enterprise, so standing in ArcGIS Enterprise, working with our UC San Diego Health, so trying to collaborate there, also setting up a dashboard to be able to better understand our users, but that's being shared with Miriam and Campus ITS. And then Campus ITS was really instrumental in providing the software licenses on all of our computers in the library. So rather than having a few classroom departments, it's across the board. And so that really bought in from library administration and Campus ITS. And then ultimately we have our students, researchers, and faculty all keeping us in check with what their needs are and how things are changing and new programs on campus. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to the next one.
Carlos has been able to join us from UC Davis. So Carlos, why don't you start sharing your screen?
Yeah, sure. One moment. Okay, there we go. Thanks, Peter. So kind of following up on Amy's points and Peter earlier, I've decided to focus on a relatively recent change at UC Davis from a cost recovery model to central funding. So a very brief background on me. I work in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy within the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences. I come from mostly an IT background, and I did my undergraduate in computer science, but I also worked in this department doing data science for a few years. And I mention this mostly for context, because this really started as a bottom-up approach, where we worked with key relationships with what I'm going to later call our champions. So similar to a lot of higher ed institutions, traditionally specialized software is paid for through cost recovery. In the case of ArcGIS, that meant a central unit paid upfront, and we recharged per device. That's not all that unusual for us, but what that really meant is that we're consistently provisioning manually around 230 licenses, and that was being billed to around 70 departments for non-coordinated purchases. That's a lot of staff time that we weren't recovering all that much money. So this is the same that we've all heard, and we all know at the end of the day, this doesn't leave us anywhere to grow. By its nature, that really means that the only people that could get the software without trouble are people that I'm going to call our core users, or core GIS users. So that really meant that anybody that's been working with ArcGIS for years, and that likely meant ArcMap. Students could get it for class, but pretty much anybody that didn't need it explicitly didn't want to be bothered to go through the process. So jump to 2018. In November 2018, we managed to get approval for joint funding from the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences, my college, and the Office of the Provost. This is really big because there's pretty much no other software at UC Davis that's centrally funded. Sometimes software as a service, but even Microsoft software is not centrally funded. So we coordinated an ArcGIS for All campaign to get the word out and encourage signups for ArcGIS Online. This was just in time for GIS Day in November 2018. So we're marketing this as we're giving away ArcGIS licenses. We coordinated with Esri, and I brought them out to do some trainings and presentations for students, faculty. I think we even did a career prospects session. So it actually had pretty good turnout for what it was. So by the end of 2018, we had eliminated the recharge. By the beginning of 2019, we had already set up single sign-on, and we had a concurrent licensing pool to provide access to ArcMap for all of our traditional users. So what did we see? In ArcMap, the differences weren't huge, but the big for us was we moved to almost exclusively concurrent licensing. We still manually provision around 40 licenses a year, but that's mostly for fieldwork. So with less effort, we're actually seeing more device connections per quarter. The key points of this, though, are that we were able to provide standardized installs and documentation, and that meant that's on demand. Nobody has to go to somebody to get the software. So that saves time and saves IT time and accounting time, and that's important for later. So for ArcGIS Pro, the differences were big. Before 2019, ArcGIS Online was pretty much only available at an extra special request. So we really only had 40 active users. So 2 years later, I think we're around like 4,300 last I checked. So obviously that's not everybody being active. So digging into that a little bit. In 2020 so far, we've had around 360 users that have logged into ArcGIS Pro. So really what we can say about this is that bringing that availability meant that GIS classes started switching from ArcMap to ArcGIS Pro. I think we're around 50-50 at this point, but we're moving forward. So why do we see that big change? I mentioned that we have 4,300, but we only have 360 ArcGIS Pro users. Our user signups obviously follow the academic schedule. Our GIS classes, though, are pretty much only 150 students a quarter, but we're consistently seeing around 600 to 700 new users a quarter. And the majority of those are definitely students. So don't spend too much time looking at the charts, but this is mainly here to illustrate the point that what we found was by providing ease of access, we see off-core usage, using this as a tool for teaching and research, jumping a lot faster than the increase in traditional GIS. Our actual most popular apps are either custom web apps or Survey 123. So this is what you're here for. How did we get here? I'm kind of sorry to say there's no magic bullet, but there's a strategy. The things that were important for us were a few key factors. Number one being cost. Esri institutional license is almost an order of magnitude cheaper than any other site license that we have at the campus. So that goes a long way. The second point being cost. Licensing being so cheap, our biggest expense with it was managing the recharges. Remember that we had 70 departments purchasing the software. That probably meant 70 accounting staff, at least 70 IT people, at least 70 times coordinating and managing provisioning license, blah, blah, blah. And that doesn't take that long to get all those people involved, adding up to the cost of the license. Third point being underutilization. All the slides up to this point were really just showing that we weren't adequately using what we were paying for. And organizations hate paying for something that we don't use. So in our case, it didn't take a lot to show that the majority of the users that were already paying for the software came from our college. And that means that we were already eating those costs, not to mention the staff time. What we were able to do was leverage some existing key relationships with what I was again calling our champions. For my department, that's our department chair, my IT director, and they brought this up to our college dean. Our key points were again, cost savings, how does that benefit the college and the departments, and where can we start using this where we weren't already. That's the researchers that weren't able to get to the software. We have farm managers starting to utilize the field apps. This is really utilizing existing expertise that we built and making it accessible. And those relationships keep growing. Our dean is now one of our champions. She brought the same argument to the office of the provost, and she was able to negotiate splitting the funding. Our college takes half the cost, provides the support, and the whole campus gets a tool and puts little to no work into getting it. So the last slide is really just, this is our wall of champions. All of these people were really instrumental in getting us to where we were and where we are, and we wouldn't have gotten there without any of them.
All right, well, thanks, Carlos. We're gonna keep moving along here so we can try and stay on track. Corey, you're gonna be up next from Oregon State University.
Okay, let me try to share my screen here. There we go. Okay, hi everybody. My name is Corey Langhoff. I work at Oregon State University in the College of Earth, Ocean, Atmospheric Sciences, CEOS. Just to start, I guess, what were our key components of our journey here to get to the best practice state? Similar to Amy and Carlos, we implemented SSO a few years ago, and that was a huge change from what we were doing before of creating and inviting users to create AGOL accounts. We usually have several hundred students every term just in our college alone, signing up for courses and needing accounts. And that was a pretty laborious process before SSO came on. Now that SSO is enabled, we automatically provision all of the licenses, and all of the experience basically is automatic now for the students, where we have very little contact with them. And that's been a huge help. There's some updating of the documentation each term as we have new versions of software. We put those onto our central software server rather than having to create separate My Esri accounts for people to download that. And that's also been a huge a boon for us. The new member defaults of assigning all of the extensions and all of ArcGIS Pro and all those things are a great tool. That's certainly further reduced our touch on what we need to do with licensing, getting people set up. As well as credits. Right now we're assigning 2,000 standard credits to everyone. And that in general serves really well. We rarely have too many people exceeding that, except in the last year or so. We have some courses, and I'm not exactly sure how they're getting there, but they will burn through 2,000 credits in about 5 minutes, and I can see it happening. And we provision them more on that. And I've actually even gone through some of the curriculum labs and tried to recreate that, and I couldn't. So I'm not sure what's going on there. That deserves some further exploration. But I think some of those courses, we might boost them up to 10,000 or something. Also, like custom roles is another thing we're using a lot. Create an instructor role that has some more admin privileges, so groups can be created by them with editing privileges, and they can manage their own students and coursework, and helps with sharing on that. Again, I'm going to create a new custom role soon to enable all of the notebook functionality that seems to be really popular. We've been running our own Jupyter servers for the last few years in several courses, and that's something that we're going to be looking to try the ArcGIS notebook. With moving content, we often have people leaving the university and need to change ownership of things. Up till now, we've been using the GeoJob ArcGIS admin tools, and that seems to be works really well. But now I'm really interested in checking out a lot more of the ArcGIS API for Python to maybe create some more custom scripts with that. I think that'll be a really good avenue to explore. Let's see, and I guess let's get to the next slide. So how did we identify people? We went around the university and identified all the different colleges who were using our ArcGIS either in research or instruction. That was pretty straightforward. It's usually the IT folks in all the colleges who are running, are managing software, installing it in labs and whatnot. Central IT with the campus manages the license server. We run concurrent servers and concurrent licensing in our labs. Although most of the users now are shifted over to named user licensing. They also manage all the contracting. Oregon has a special contract with Esri that all of the governmental agencies in the state are under one contract, and then we have separate organizations for each group. But that's really eased the process of who pays for what and things. We just kind of pay up to the state, and they take care of that. And it turned out nobody was really running the show per se at Oregon State in terms of who's doing what, who's making the calls, who do you go to for support. And when I came on board about 5 years ago, I kind of took on that role, having many years of GIS experience. And I think that's really helped the situation in that a lot of the IT folks, they're great and everything, but they're not necessarily embedded into the GIS workflows and things. And so I think they've really appreciated to have somebody that they can, to understand why we're implementing some of these things. And so that's been really helpful. So I guess this is kind of a redundant question. How did we identify collaborators? It's really just looking at who's using it in all the different colleges. We work with Central IT in implementing the SSO. We work with power users in some of the colleges. The University Forest, Oregon State Forestry owns like a 36 square mile school forest right outside of town that they manage for research in instruction, and they're power users. And so some of those folks definitely we have coordinated with on how to get this streamlined and going. We work with IT to try to work on versions and things. And this is kind of the last slide here, is like how many, what are some of these tips? We work with IT to meet with them to each quarter to determine versionings and things. That's one of our biggest hiccups, is the making sure that all of the campus labs and all of the colleges kind of settle on a version for the year, which is big, because otherwise we have students creating a project in one version and then they go to, say, the library or to another college lab, and that version doesn't allow a project to be open. That was certainly very important in ArcGIS for desktop. Seems to be a little bit less so for pro. So that's been a big thing. Centralizing control of licensing, GIS support, and ArcGIS Online administration with a GIS person. As I mentioned, I think that's been really successful. Trying to foster a culture of moving forward with versions and deployments of new features. I think in the past, there was a lot of reticence to do this. They wanted to hold back several versions. People would write scripts and they maybe a new version wouldn't support, say, VB scripts and things like that. And so they wanted to hold back. It created this environment where things were held back so far, we were years out of date. And so that was really kind of tough. And I think we've solved that. And now we're moving forward with the latest version at the end of the summers and trying to stick with that through the year so IT folks aren't burdened with re-imaging all of the labs every term or things like that. And then finally, working with contracting folks to make sure the licensing is up to date. We just went through a license renewal here at the end of July. And there was some turnover in the contracting staff at the university. And it's been a little bit painful, I would say, of just trying to make sure that everything is lined up, all of our ducks in a row, and that it's going smoothly. Today, I'm going to be spending part of the day untangling some of that a little bit more. But all in all, it's going quite well. And I'll really thank Esri for all the new features and all the help that they've given us. They've been super generous with all of the licensing and everything. So thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Corey. We're going to keep moving right along. And Ryan from Penn State University is up next.
All right. Can you hear me and see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So like the other speakers had said, I'm just one person, part of a much larger team that got all this done. I'm in the Department of Geography, but we've had people across campus who have really all efforted a lot to get this done. I'm not going to name them all here, but I do want to acknowledge that this is a big team effort for us. And really our goal, like everyone else, is just what can we do to get GIS into the hands of people that want to use it and just get out of their way. So sort of the key components that we've implemented to try and get there is first setting up that single institutional Penn State-wide ArcGIS Online organization. And that eliminated, I don't even know how many there were, but 15, 20 plus individual ArcGIS Online organizations that individual departments and groups had created, each of which requiring the manual creation and management of users, which was becoming an impossibly onerous task for the poor people who had found themselves in that role. So we eliminated all of that. SSO was enabled not long ago, and everyone at the university just has an account by default. It's really revolutionized the way we've been able to do everything. So that was really key, getting that in place. We've also simplified the process through which people just get the software. So now with the online organization, a lot of stuff is just automatically provisioned. The licenses for Pro are already there. You just download the installer and you're good to go. Even people on campus lab computers, Pro's installed there, and they can just sign right in and off they go. We've also simplified the procedures for getting other software too. There's some self-service ways they can get that through Penn State's central software licensing unit. So we've really, I think, improved that process of just getting software in the hands of people, letting them use it. A lot of our efforts really started some time ago where we were looking at how costs were distributed across campus, because years ago, it was the end users that were paying incrementally for the software they were using. And that was confusing for people, and it threw up some barriers, especially for students who didn't want to have to pay anything or couldn't pay anything for software. So we've been able to kind of straighten that out. We've taken the burden of cost away from end users and put it up at the department level, which has been huge. And essentially now software is just free to end users. So in theory, there are no barriers to people getting access to this stuff, which is, in my opinion, is maybe the most important thing that we've accomplished, especially for our students. So stakeholders, our user communities, the faculty, staff, students, and like I said, they're all now sort of organized within our colleges, departments, institutes, other groups at the university, because it's at those group levels that there are still some costs. So those are a very important group of stakeholders that we have to work closely with to be sure that everyone's comfortable with the distribution of costs. It seems fair and equitable and commensurate with the amount of usage in that particular unit. And then the third big stakeholder is our central software licensing group, because that's a group that manages all of the university's software, Esri, Microsoft, Adobe, whatever. So we still need to work closely with them to get all this done. And they've been great. In terms of buy-in, it really came down to just communication and relationship building with all of these individuals. So with the user community, it was learning from them what they're using, talking to them about how they pay for software and how much they're paying and ways we could do that better. And it was communicating with our licensing group and the users about ways we could do this better that would be beneficial for both ends, the licensing group and the user group. And just educating each other. Because I think a lot of us didn't fully understand, like the licensing people didn't really understand what GIS software was all about, because it is kind of a weird thing that we work with relative to other software. And likewise, we didn't understand some of the constraints that our licensing and central finance people were confronted with. So that was very, very valuable, just communicating all of that. And at the end of the day, it came down to volunteers and finding a motivated GIS user group. So I was just one of a handful of us who just recognized that at Penn State we had a really good thing. We have a good resource and good stuff going on, but we could do this better. And so we sort of took it upon ourselves to effort to communicate, reach out, and get this stuff done. So volunteering was pretty key for us. The technical side of things, so the volunteers in our GIS user community, we still manage a lot of this. So our ArcGIS Online organization, we manage a lot of that. Dan in the College of Architecture does a lot there. Jim in the Department of Geography, he manages a dashboard that we put up with the help of the folks at Michigan. And then myself and Beth and a lot of other people do a lot of outreach, helping people get on board with this stuff and use it. And then the central software group still does the licensing and getting that cost recovery from the departments. That's very important. And then we did have help from IT to help us get the SSO implemented, because there were some technical considerations there that were a little bit beyond most of us. And again, how do we get buy-in on the technical side? It was communication. It was demonstrating the benefits of this to, like I said, to all parties involved, from central people down to the user community. Demonstrating how this is going to be better and worth the effort was really, really important. And just getting the right people involved, getting people that were motivated, getting people that were in a position to get something done, finding them and building those relationships was super important. And we had countless meetings and conversations as groups, as individuals, but it was all great. It was all totally worth it. So to conclude here, my tips for those of you who might be thinking about getting this rolling at your university, I would say be prepared to volunteer. I think someone's going to have to just step up and be motivated to do it, and someone's going to have to sort of get the cart rolling. Then it's building relationships with people that you need to, that you don't have so far, and then fostering relationships with the people that you are working with. That is key, and that I think is going to be a trend you've heard today. And then finally, especially if you're a university like we are, where we don't really have a central geospatial unit where all this stuff would logically fall into place, there's going to be a lot of us kind of figuring this out. Reach out to people who have done it. So reach out to us who have gone through this. I mean, we reached out to Peter at Michigan and Lan at Minnesota and all sorts of other places, and Jerry has been super helpful. So don't hesitate to reach out, because I would say most are totally willing to give you some tips and insights. I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you, Ryan. We probably are going to go a little bit past the hour here. Apologize, we're getting a bit behind schedule. I'm going to hand it off to the UC Riverside folks. We have a half-hour break before the next session, so hopefully you'll be able to stick around a little extra time to hear their great message. Dahlia, if you want to kick us off.
And we actually do have 15 minutes after the hour, so we're in a good shape.
Gary and Peter, thank you for inviting me and my team from Information Technology Solutions at UC Riverside to speak to our unique approach in implementing SSO, with IT creating a collaboration task force of several teams. The reality is, while this approach may seem unique to someone coming in from the outside, which is what happened to Cancerina when we invited her to join our kickoff meeting, this approach is not really unique to us. It's our standard approach for all process improvement projects. The ArcGIS SSO implementation was a sub-project of a bigger process improvement project called SRLM, or Software Requisition and License Management. And at the heart of this approach, at the heart of this collaborative approach is our belief that people come before the process, and that engaging all of our stakeholders and giving them a voice is key to the success of any project, because it ensures that we have their buy-in. So that's how we get their buy-in. With that said, I would like to turn it over to Freddie, who's our assessment coordinator, who will give a brief overview of the assessments.
Thank you, Dahlia. So as Dahlia mentioned, this was part of a broader effort. Dahlia and I were part of a dynamic team within our IT organization where our focus is on improvement projects. I'm responsible for a gap analysis that we call the assessment, where I dive into the customer experience to see how well our people, process, and technology are aligned. As part of this assessment, we start with what problem do we want to solve? So this drives our compelling business case to try to get support and improve our process and services. We use data to collect data to illustrate the problem. We meet with key stakeholders to document use cases and process flows. We listen to what their pain points are with the current process and how they consume our services. We collaborate with process owners to understand what recommendations or suggestions they may have to address pain points that they may be experiencing, whether it be frontline support or, again, our customers. So really this approach is focus on the customer experience and kind of working backwards. Once we have those recommendations, suggestions from our customers, we then put them into an action plan and prioritize the quick wins so we can start making an immediate impact. We measure our success through a KPI-based approach to process improvement. So in this particular project, as Dahlia mentioned, we were focused on license management and software requisition. So we noticed that there was a high volume of service requests and incidents related to our enterprise software offerings. Our customers were having to wait on average 5 days to get access to the software and tools they needed to get their work done. Essentially, we were the gatekeeper. From a people perspective, we had insufficient training on supported software and license agreements. Eligibility requirements were not really clear to our customers or support staff. We also had outdated support material that wasn't easy to locate. From a process point of view, we didn't have a common process to track, issue, distribute, or request enterprise licensed software. Account provisioning, as others have shared, was a very laborious and manual process. From a technology perspective, application user types, roles, and privileges were not clearly defined or understood by support staff. Our software catalog was outdated and difficult to manage and maintain. So what were the recommendations? Well, we needed to establish a common process for getting GIS out to our customers. We also needed to have a one-stop shop that all of our customers could go to request and download any of our enterprise software offerings. We also needed to take the step to enable SSO to improve license and account management. We needed to come up with a process to migrate account holders to enterprise accounts. We also needed to come up with custom roles with default permissions, for console administrators, faculty, and students. Finally, we needed to overhaul our approach with our knowledge base, have clear instructions for our customers so they knew where to go to access available software offerings.
So once I get Freddie's recommendations, which are recommendations that Freddie doesn't come up with alone, but he comes up with in conjunction with everybody, all the stakeholders that participate in the assessment process with him. I'm able to take these recommendations and create a project plan. For the ArcGIS SSO implementation, the plan consisted of the following 5 action items. At the head of them were the communication plan, was to create and execute the communication plan. And then obviously to enable SSO, but for that, and as Amy mentioned, we have a sandbox and production environment. So first we enabled SSO on the sandbox environment, and then we enabled it on production. And then we were planning to migrate content from the pre-SSO non-enterprise accounts to the enterprise accounts, and then finally to disable these non-enterprise accounts. And from this action plan, it was easy to determine who our technical and our non-technical implementation partners were. And on the next slide, you will see that we worked with 6 teams across the organization, 6 different groups, and we had 3 project leads. So, you know, and let's see. Now I'd like to turn it over to Alex, our Manager of Communication and Training, who will speak to our communication strategy.
Thank you, Dahlia. First and foremost, understanding the scope and timeline of a project, as well as those impacted users, is what allows us to determine which communication artifacts are needed to successfully roll out a change or new initiative to campus. In this particular case with ArcGIS, we identified it would be most effective to contact the users directly to make them aware of the change and dates, and to include resources such as a knowledge-based article that provides step-by-step technical guidance. Additionally, we had to update the UCR ArcGIS landing page, both from a content standpoint as well as a visual standpoint to ensure university branding, of course. So these were just a few of the various communication artifacts that we identified that required action as we devised a plan according to the project timeline and stakeholder feedback. In this particular case, however, once the project was in flight, we actually realized that due to the various versions of GIS we supported, we needed to send separate targeted communication to specific users, for example, our ArcGIS Power users, to avoid any confusion. This resulted in the need for additional communication artifacts than originally planned, but it was a great example of how a communication plan needs to be adaptable so as to respond to the needs of the project and any unforeseen challenges. And I also think it's important to note that the KB articles that we ended up creating for this effort were reviewed by Esri to ensure accuracy. So that was another great example of strong collaboration. Finally, prior to rolling out any communication to campus, we engaged our help desk teams and provided them with all of the artifacts to ensure that they were aware of the changes being made and the communication users would receive so that they could answer support calls and tickets accordingly. And this last step was truly key in us delivering a smooth rollout and excellent customer support to our campus community. Since the rollout, we've also made ArcGIS available in our virtual computer lab for students and faculty use. So to summarize, we enabled SSO single sign-on back in February, and there were 2 technical lessons learned. Have your IT ensure that your SSO sandbox and production environments are congruent. And IT does not need to disable non-enterprise accounts and make users go through the hassle of migrating their content. We just let the accounts age out, and that was what worked best for us. So to summarize kind of key takeaways here, start with the user in mind, gather your technical and functional requirements, align your process, people, and technology, and tailor your communication to your stakeholders. And we just want to end on this African proverb that we think really aligns with our approach and says a lot about us. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm gonna share my screen here again. So thanks to our various panelists. just to sort of take away some summary thoughts from that as we prepare for our Q&A part of this. I think you've really seen now some examples where navigating the change to these best practices can start from a variety of places, whether it's providing greater access to GIS, simplifying licensing, cost reduction. I think you've seen a variety of starting points there. And that a single unit can step up to lead the charge for the whole institution, often because it's simpler for that single unit to do it for the whole institution than if they have to put all the checks and balances in place to do it just for themselves. Along those lines, centralizing admin of ArcGIS Online is key. However, it doesn't have to be done at the top level of the institution. We've seen some examples of grassroots collections of units doing this, as well as central organizations. Time and cost recovered by switching to single sign-on, I think, is a key message we're hearing from everyone, especially in these times of budget cutting. Benefits of eliminating and streamlining these manual gatekeeper steps so that you're empowering everyone with access to everything. Consolidating multiple ArcGIS Online organization, help reduces barriers to collaboration. And then, for the collaborations we're talking about, the keys here of communication and trusted relationships to building these successful communities. After switching to SSO, and from an enterprise accounts from the old ArcGIS accounts, I think let it fade away is a great way to put it. Some of us, looked at this and thought, boy, we're going to have to do scripting and migrate things. And I think most of us learned the lessons. We don't really have to do that. The users can make their own groups as publishers and share between the accounts if they want to, but we can leave it up to them. And then, as Ryan pointed out, be willing to volunteer and especially at the start to get things going. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jerry to see what sort of questions we have. We have about 5 minutes, I think, for questions.
Yep, so we have about 6 minutes, so we should be able to address a few questions. And lots of wonderful questions came through. We won't be able to get to all of them, but hopefully we'll continue the conversation in the later sessions. So what I'll do is I'll read up a question. We're not going to go in the order in which they came in, but sort of group them together, some commonalities. So I'll read a question, and then I'll ask a panelist to answer that question. So Amy, this next one is for you. We specifically asked when you had the discussion. So I'll let you address it. And then knowing that there's, of course, different ways of approaching it. So the question is, Andrew asks, please discuss Amy's point of disabling pre-SSO accounts. Did the content ownership get moved? Was this scripted? Is the script shared?
So multiple ways, and I know others have talked about it. Those pre-SSO accounts, we've actually, I think, as Dahlia and their team mentioned, just letting them age out. So those accounts that were pre-SSO and SSO, meaning it's a researcher, right, who's heavily into GIS, right? So far, we've just let their content reside in their accounts that they're using, and eventually we'll talk with them about migrating their content from maybe pre-SSO to SSO. We may look at using the AGO admin assist, or we may look at that for scripting. But right now, we're letting those pre-SSO either age out, or we'll eventually get researchers' content into a single one. But whether it's scripting or using the AGO admin assist, that's still to be determined.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amy. As you mentioned, different approaches, and Dahlia also mentioned, and a couple of others, that letting those accounts go is probably the easiest way to go. All right, so Peter, this next one, and there are a couple of sort of related questions, so they'll be for you. So for one, Nelly asked, can SSO work virtually from home? So that's a quick one there, but I'll read up the rest. From Brittany, if my university were to switch to a university-wide license, are there additional costs to maintaining both ArcMap and SSO, ArcGIS Online on campus? In other words, is it cost saving to switch fully to ArcGIS Online and Pro only? Right now at my university, departments are charged per computer with ArcMap activated on it. And we discussed the cost recovery. Carlos explained it very well, so did Ryan. And that was actually, there are a couple of cost recovery sort of questions that came through. So hopefully all of those were addressed. But Peter, I'll let you answer.
Yeah, so maybe to the first one, can SSO work virtually from home? I mean, it works anywhere. Your campus may choose to implement a VPN requirement for some services, but generally campuses usually leave ArcGIS Online open to the world and your single sign-on open. So if you're logging into other of your university services through your university single sign instance, you shouldn't have any issue getting to your university's ArcGIS Online instance. And then in terms of switching licenses, you know, it's really hard. We've never had this cost recovery kind of approach where we charge per computer. And that doesn't really map well to this sort of cloud GIS aspect of where you're giving access to everyone. It is a tough transition to make, but I think you've heard some great examples, of like Carlos's example of where they did that, and it was just saved so much money by going to this single point of purchase, even though that itself was spread against a couple different schools. But generally, if you can get ArcMap or ArcGIS Desktop out of the equation, you no longer have any need to run a concurrent license server. And depending on what you're using that for, if it's just for ArcGIS or if you've got other FlexNet licenses on there, that can be a significant cost savings of not having to run and maintain the license server. So I hope that sort of answers the question.
Hopefully. All right, so Ryan, this next question will be for you. So it comes from Amy, and questions for schools with GIS degrees, certificates, classes. Have you seen an increase or decrease in GIS course enrollment after implementing ArcGIS college-wide?
Wow, that's a really great question. I mean, in terms of enrollment in the sort of traditional regular GIS classes, it's hard to say if there's been an increase that we could attribute to this. It has certainly made teaching those classes easier because we are transitioning to pro, and it just makes everything so much easier. Plus, with this whole COVID just rapid switch to online back in the spring, since a lot of our students were already plugged into our SSO, ArcGIS Online with Pro, it made that transition much easier than it would have been otherwise. So that was great. What I would say, and this echoes what I think some of the other speakers said, was that by enabling this and just having these just access to everybody by default, I think usage of GIS across campus outside of the traditional GIS courses and little silos, that has increased tremendously, which is so amazing to see. And then that provides really good feedback for administration to show them just how pervasive and important GIS is very broadly.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Hopefully that addressed the question. So we'll take one more last question before we conclude the session. And this question, so Corey, if you don't mind addressing, and then Carlos, if you'd like to jump in as well. And then anyone actually can jump in from the panelists. But so with, again, started from the same question, same person, Eric asked a little bit two-folded. With SSO and student accounts, do students use their unique university login ID and university password to access ArcGIS Pro, ArcGIS Online? If students are using their university ID and password, has privacy issues, essentially, are there any privacy issues for Esri? For example, Esri having access to the student IDs. So Corey or Carlos?
I guess, yeah, I guess I can answer that. We haven't, some of the security things are handled by my boss and things like that, so I don't have all the answers to that. But we haven't noticed it. We haven't had any privacy issues with that. All of the university IDs are stored in the local either LDAP or AD databases and things like that. And with SSO, you it contacts those databases. So I don't think Esri actually has that data per se. They're just contacting the university database. So the way it works is when you sign into SSO, you choose an organization, and it asks you like what organization are you in. Once you enter that in, it redirects you to an OSU logon page where you input your student credentials. So it's not actually touching Esri servers or anything like that at that point. It authenticates you with the university databases. And then we also have Duo enabled. And so when you sign in, you'll get a Duo request to your phone that you have to accept to sign in. So no, I don't think there's any real security issues with that if it's set up properly.
Yeah, very much echoing Corey. Our setup is pretty similar, but as part of SAML, which is actually the technology behind the SSO, you actually get to choose what information gets passed through. In our case, we pass through the email address and first and last name. So that's what actually ends up in the ArcGIS organization. We actually do pass through a select number in our environment of Active Directory groups, which we can then use to populate groups in ArcGIS Online. But again, that is something that you get to entirely set up on the identity management side of it. And so you get to choose exactly what information gets passed to Esri.
One thing I noticed that the biggest issue that I deal with single sign-ons is students forget that they don't actually need a username and password. I get this all the time, like, hey, reset my password, and I just have a canned email response that I copy paste and say, hey, you don't need a password, it's all single sign-on, so here you go.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. Make sure that you have good documentation that says use the enterprise login, don't use the ArcGIS logins.